My mom showed up at my door with a suitcase, saying she was moving in because I owed her care. When I blocked the door, she screamed, "I should have left you at the hospital when you were born." I just stared at her. That was 10 months ago. Yesterday, she was let out of court in handcuffs, screaming my name. My mom spent my whole life treating me like trash, but now that she's old and sick, she suddenly thinks I owe her free care. I shut the door in her face. I grew up with a mother who never really wanted me. At least, that's how it always felt. She loved telling people I had to grow up fast because I had her, like I was some kind of burden she never asked for. From the time I could remember, she made it clear I was on my own. When I was 8, I wanted to join an after-school art program. She said, "Do you think we're made of money? Besides, you're not talented. Don't embarrass yourself." 2 weeks later, she bought my cousin, her favorite, an expensive keyboard for music lessons because she has potential. At 10, I asked for help with a school project. She told me, "I'm not your teacher. Figure it out yourself." But when my younger brother needed help, she sat with him for hours. When I was sick at 12 and had a fever, she still made me cook dinner for the family. I burned the rice, and she yelled at me in front of everyone, "See? You can't even do the simplest thing right." At 15, I wanted to get a part-time job to save for college. She told me, "Why bother? Girls like you end up married and working in a grocery store." My brother got a job the next year, and she bragged to everyone about how independent he was. When I turned 18 and got into a decent college, she refused to help me with the application for financial aid. She said, "If you can't figure it out, you don't deserve to go." I ended up missing the deadline and had to take a gap year to work. During that gap year, I paid for all my own clothes, books, and food most days. She still asked me for money sometimes, saying, "It's just a small loan, I'll pay you back," and never did. I eventually moved out at 20 and have been fully independent since. I worked 2 jobs to put myself through college. I called her occasionally, but our conversations were always short, and she usually found a way to criticize me. "Your hair is too messy. You're getting too skinny. You think you're better than me now?" She never once visited me during my college years, even when I invited her to my graduation. She said, "I don't have the time or money to waste on that." A few months ago, she called out of the blue. She said she was getting older and had some health issues. Then she said, "I've decided you'll be the one to take care of me. You're single and don't have kids, so you have the time." I asked her why she thought I'd be the one to do it. She said, "Because you're my daughter. That's what daughters are for." I reminded her that she never supported me or even acted like she wanted me around. She replied, "Don't bring up the past. I did my best. You're being dramatic." When I refused, she got nasty. "You're ungrateful. I gave you life and you can't even give back when I need you. What kind of daughter abandons her own mother?" I told her she had other options: home care services, my brother, or even her sisters. She scoffed, "Your brother has a family. He can't be bothered with this. And my sisters are busy. You, on the other hand, owe me." Over the next few weeks, she called multiple times, each time trying a different approach. Sometimes she cried on the phone saying, "I'll probably die alone, but at least you won't be inconvenienced." Other times, she'd get angry. "You think you're better than me just because you went to college. Remember, without me, you wouldn't even be here." She also tried to make me look bad to relatives. I got a text from my aunt saying, "Your mom says you refuse to help her when she's sick. That's cold." I replied, explaining the years of neglect. My aunt said, "Well, that's in the past. She's still your mother." Last week, she showed up at my apartment without warning, suitcase in hand. She said, "I'm moving in. It'll be easier this way." I told her she couldn't stay. She tried to push past me into the apartment. I blocked her and said firmly that she needed to leave. She started yelling, "This is what I get for raising you? I should have left you at the hospital when you were born." That comment hit hard, but I didn't back down. I called a taxi for her and told her to go back home. She cursed at me the whole way to the curb. After she left, I blocked her number. I called my landlord and told him not to let anyone in without my permission. I also reached out to her local community center and gave them her info so they could connect her with services for seniors who need help. I haven't heard from her since, but I did get a message from my brother. "Thanks for handling mom's care stuff. I couldn't deal with it." That told me everything I needed to know. Everyone just assumed I'd do it because I'm the daughter. Now I live in peace. I cook in my own kitchen without being criticized. I sleep without worrying about surprise knocks at the door, and I spend my time building a life I actually want. She wanted a caretaker. What she really needed was someone to finally say no to her, and I'm glad I was that person. Last night, just as I was about to fall asleep, there was a knock at my door. I froze. It was past midnight. I checked the people, and there she was, standing in the hallway with no suitcase this time, just a strange, satisfied smile. "I found a way to make you let me in," she said. My whole body went cold as she pulled out a folder from behind her back and waved it at the people. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone with shaking hands. The numbers blurred as I tried to dial 911. She kept talking through the door about some emergency conservatorship and how the papers meant I had to take care of her now. The operator answered, and I whispered that my mother was at my door making threats. She asked if there was immediate danger of violence. I said no, and she told me this sounded like a civil matter, but they'd send someone for a wellness check. Through the door, Margaret started wailing so loud I knew the whole floor could hear her. She was crying about her own daughter calling the police on a sick old woman, and how all the neighbors would know what kind of person I was. I sat on my couch and waited. 20 minutes later, 2 officers showed up, and I watched through the peephole as they found her sitting on the hallway floor with her folder spread out around her. She showed them papers and started telling them I was mentally unstable, and she was just trying to help me. Officer Martinez knocked on my door and asked to speak with me while his partner stayed with Margaret. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. My voice stayed steady as I explained the years of neglect and how she'd been harassing me for weeks. He took notes in a small notebook and looked at the papers she'd brought. He said they looked suspicious because Colorado requires actual court hearings for conservatorships, not just paperwork someone fills out. The officers went back to Margaret and told her the documents weren't valid court orders and she needed to leave the property immediately. She grabbed her chest and started gasping about chest pains. They called paramedics while I stood in my doorway watching her performance. The paramedics arrived and checked her blood pressure and heart rate and oxygen levels. They found nothing wrong. After everyone finally left, I went back inside and locked my door. I sat in my dark apartment and every little sound from the hallway made me jump. I opened my laptop and emailed my landlord about what happened and asked if I could get a security camera for my door. Sleep didn't come until the sun was already coming up. My phone buzzed the next morning with a text from Daniel asking what I did, because mom was at the hospital saying I gave her a heart attack. I didn't respond, but took a screenshot of his message. My phone showed 17 missed calls from aunts and uncles and cousins. At work that day, I stared stared at my computer screen trying to focus on the marketing presentation due by Friday. My supervisor Jennifer walked by my desk twice before stopping to ask if everything was okay. I gave her a vague answer about family issues and she nodded but looked concerned. That evening when I got home, Marcus from down the hall stopped me before I could get to my door. He asked about the scene from last night and if that woman was really my mother. He seemed genuinely worried, not just looking for gossip. I nodded and he pulled out his phone to show me he'd recorded some of it from his doorway for safety reasons. 3 days passed and I'd installed a Ring doorbell and started leaving for work an hour earlier and coming home later just to avoid any chance of running into her. The constant worry was exhausting, but at least there'd been no sign of Margaret anywhere. Daniel sent another text asking why I was ignoring everyone, but I didn't answer that one either. The next morning, I found a thick manila envelope shoved under my apartment door when I went to grab my newspaper. Inside were dozens of photos of me taken from far away over the past week. Me walking to my car in the parking garage. Me buying coffee at the shop down the street. Me sitting at my desk through the office window. My hands started shaking as I flipped through each one. At the bottom was a note in Margaret's handwriting that said, "A mother always watches over her children." I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the police station with the whole envelope. Detective Holloway looked at each photo carefully and took notes about the dates and locations I could remember. He opened a stalking case file and told me I should think about getting a restraining order right away. The next day, I went to the courthouse and filled out all the paperwork for a temporary restraining order. The clerk handed me page after page of forms asking for dates and details about every incident. She explained it would take 2 to 3 weeks to get a court date for the hearing. I spent 3 hours writing down everything I could remember about Margaret's behavior over the past months. I wonder what's really in that folder she's waving around at midnight. Something tells me those papers aren't as official as she wants them to seem, especially showing up this late with that strange smile on her face. That evening, Marcus knocked on my door holding a container of soup. He said I looked stressed earlier and his grandmother's recipe always helped. We talked for a few minutes and he mentioned seeing a gray sedan parked outside for hours lately. After he left, I decided to check my credit report online since something felt off. 3 credit cards had been opened in my name in the last month and all of them were maxed out. My credit score had dropped from excellent to poor in just a few weeks. Margaret must have kept my social security number from when I was a kid. A week later, I was at the grocery store picking up milk when Margaret appeared at the end of my aisle. She pushed her cart toward me and said loudly that everyone should meet her daughter who abandoned her. Other shoppers turned to stare at us as she kept talking about what a terrible person I was. I left my cart right there and walked out as fast as I could without running. The next morning, I went to my bank and spent hours on the phone with credit card companies. Each company wanted different documents and proof that I hadn't opened those accounts myself. The bank manager suggested I freeze my credit completely to stop any more cards from being opened. He gave me a stack of fraud paperwork to fill out and file with the credit bureaus. That night, I couldn't eat dinner because my stomach was in knots. Every bite I tried to take felt like it would come right back up. I'd lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks without trying. My friend Carla texted asking if I wanted to get drinks, but I couldn't imagine pretending everything was normal. The next day at lunch, Daniel showed up at my workplace and found me in the break room. He told me Margaret was staying with him now, and she'd told him everything about the credit cards. He said she claimed I made her do it by cutting her off completely. Then he told me to fix this, or he'd press charges for elder abuse against me. I went straight to building security after he left and gave them photos of both Daniel and Margaret. My supervisor Jennifer overheard me talking to the security guard and pulled me into her office. I finally told her everything that had been happening over the past few weeks. She immediately called HR and said they needed to work out a safety plan for me at work. They set up a buddy system where someone would walk me to my car after work and security would do extra rounds near my desk. 2 weeks passed without any major incidents, just the constant feeling of being watched. Jennifer suggested I talk to someone about everything that was happening, so I made an appointment with Dr. Nina Patel, a therapist who worked with people dealing with family trauma. Her office was small and warm with plants everywhere. She listened to my whole story without interrupting once. When I finished, she leaned forward and explained that what I was experiencing was typical narcissistic abuse escalation. She told me to document everything and avoid engaging directly with Margaret. The next morning at work, my phone rang while I was updating a client presentation. It was Aunt Rosa. She immediately launched into how Margaret was sick, really sick this time, with early stage dementia. She said I needed to help with her care since I was her daughter. I asked for medical documentation to verify this diagnosis. Rosa went silent for a moment, then hung up on me. 3 days later, I got a call from Linda Morales at Adult Protective Services. Someone had filed a report claiming I was abusing my elderly mother. Linda's voice was professional, but I could hear something else there too, like she'd dealt with this kind of thing before. She asked if we could meet to discuss the situation. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment that afternoon. Linda was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with kind eyes and a folder full of paperwork. She explained that the report claimed I was denying my mother necessary care and had physically assaulted her. I showed her all my documentation, the photos, the recordings, everything I'd been collecting. Linda nodded as she reviewed it all, then told me she recognized this pattern and would need to do a home visit with Margaret instead of pursuing the complaint against me. That night, around 3 in the morning, my phone started buzzing with alerts from my Ring doorbell. I grabbed it and saw Margaret on the video feed, trying different keys in my lock. My hands shook as I watched her jiggle the handle, then try another key. I called 911 while keeping the video feed open. She tried 3 more keys before suddenly looking around and walking away quickly. The police arrived 15 minutes later, but she was long gone. I showed them the video and they took a report. The next day, Detective Holloway called with news. They'd found the gray sedan Marcus had mentioned seeing around my building. It was a rental in Margaret's name. When they searched it with a warrant, they found a GPS tracker in a box in the back seat that matched one they'd discovered on my car during their investigation. This elevated everything to felony stalking charges. A month after that midnight visit, the restraining order hearing finally arrived. I walked into the courthouse with all my evidence organized in a binder. Margaret was already there with Daniel and a lawyer, an older man in an expensive suit. As soon as the hearing started, Margaret's lawyer claimed I was mentally unstable and that she was the one who needed protection from me. He presented medical records showing injuries Margaret claimed I had caused during our confrontations. The photos showed bruises on her arms and a cut on her forehead. I knew I'd never touched her. The judge, a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight, reviewed all the evidence from both sides. She looked at my recording recordings, my photos, the police reports. Detective Holloway testified about the GPS tracker and the stalking investigation. Margaret's lawyer tried to argue elder abuse, saying I was denying a sick woman care. That's when Linda Morales took the stand. She testified about her investigation findings, explaining that Margaret was physically capable and financially stable, with no signs of dementia or physical abuse. The judge asked Margaret directly about the GPS tracker and the late-night visits. Margaret started to answer, but then stopped and just glared at me. After reviewing everything, the judge granted a 2-year restraining order. Margaret jumped up and screamed that I'd regret this, that she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of daughter I was. Daniel had to grab her arm to stop her from coming toward me. The bailiff stepped forward and warned her about contempt of court. She kept yelling as Daniel dragged her out of the courtroom. In the parking garage after court, I made it to my car before everything hit me. I sat there and sobbed, all the relief and exhaustion and grief mixing together until I couldn't tell what I was feeling anymore. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus asking how it went. I realized right then that I'd gotten more support from a neighbor I'd barely known than from my entire family. 3 days later, I was back at work trying to focus on normal tasks. Jennifer had moved my desk away from the windows and closer to the security office without me even asking. I checked the security camera feeds on my phone constantly, my heart racing every time I saw a gray car in the parking lot. Every sound in the hallway made me tense up. The restraining order was supposed to make me feel safe, but instead, I just felt like I was waiting for the next thing to happen. That feeling got worse when my credit monitoring app pinged my phone the next morning with an alert about someone trying to open a bank account in my name. The attempt got blocked thanks to the freeze I'd put on everything, but the IP address made my stomach drop because I recognized it from when Daniel used my Wi-Fi last year during Thanksgiving. I stared at the screen for a long time before putting my phone down and trying to focus on breakfast, but then someone knocked hard on my door, and when I opened it, a guy in a cheap suit handed me papers and said I'd been served. The lawsuit paperwork was thick and full of legal language, but the basic idea was clear enough because Margaret was suing me for emotional distress and financial support, claiming I owed her $50,000 for raising me. My hands shook as I read through page after page of her lawyer's arguments about how she was entitled to compensation for 18 years of care and how I'd abandoned her in her time of need. I called around until I found a lawyer named James Smith who specialized in family law and elder abuse cases, and when I showed him the lawsuit in his cramped office downtown, he actually laughed and told me she had no case, but could make my life hell for months. He suggested we countersue for the identity theft and stalking damages while pulling out forms and explaining the process, his fingers moving fast over his keyboard as he typed up our response. Later that week, Nina helped me process everything during our session, explaining how Margaret was trying to regain control through the legal system while we worked on breathing exercises to manage the anxiety that kept building in my chest. She had me practice setting boundaries with family members who kept reaching out on Margaret's behalf, role-playing different scenarios until I felt more confident saying no. 2 weeks crawled by with constant paperwork and phone calls until Linda called with an update that made everything worse because Margaret had filed complaints with my employer, my landlord, and even my gym, claiming I was dangerous. Each complaint required its own set of documentation to refute, turning my life into endless forms and defending myself against accusations that got more creative each time. I spent hours gathering evidence and writing statements, my dining table covered in papers and folders organized by date and type of complaint. Marcus showing up with soup while casually mentioning a stalking sedan is peak neighbor energy. Here's some comfort food and also maybe you're being watched. Enjoy your evening. Marcus must have noticed how stressed I looked because he invited me over for tea in his apartment, the first time I'd socialized with anyone in weeks. His place was neat and calm, nothing like the chaos of my life, and he told me about his own father who'd been similar, controlling and vindictive until the day he died. He promised it would get better once I weathered what he called their extinction burst, the final desperate attempts to regain control before they finally gave up. 3 days after that conversation, I got an email from my company's HR department that made my blood run cold because someone had called claiming to be a detective and said I was under investigation for elder abuse. They'd almost suspended me immediately, but Jennifer had vouched for me and demanded verification, which revealed it was Margaret impersonating an officer. The detective handling my case added impersonating a law enforcement officer to Margaret's growing list of charges when I brought him the email and phone records. He warned me the DA might bargain it down because juries tend to sympathize with elderly mothers even when they're clearly in the wrong, which made me want to scream at the unfairness of it all. That same afternoon, Daniel texted me screenshots of Margaret's Facebook posts where she'd created a group called Parents Abandoned by Ungrateful Children, with my photo as the main example. She'd gathered 40 members who commented horrible things about me, some even threatening to teach me a lesson if they ever saw me in person. I blocked the group but kept the screenshots for evidence, adding them to my growing pile of documentation about her harassment campaign. The stress of everything finally caught up with me at the grocery store when I saw an older woman who looked like Margaret from behind and suddenly couldn't breathe. My chest got tight and my vision went fuzzy, and I dropped my basket right there in the cereal aisle while other shoppers stared. A kind employee helped me to a quiet room in the back and brought me water while I sat there shaking and trying to remember Nina's breathing exercises. After that, I realized I couldn't shop at regular hours anymore because the risk of running into her or someone from that Facebook group was too high. 2 months crawled by with me doing all my shopping at weird hours like 2 a.m. or ordering everything online for pickup. My lawyer finally got all the paperwork together and filed our countersuit against Margaret for identity theft and harassment and defamation. She said Margaret would get served within the week, and that usually makes people back off. I started going to this support group for people with narcissistic parents that met every Thursday at the community center downtown. The first time I walked in, I almost turned around, but this older woman named Patricia smiled at me and patted the chair next to her. She told the group how her mom had done the same stuff for years until she finally got a permanent restraining order. It made me feel less crazy hearing other people had gone through this too. 3 days after that meeting, I came home from work and saw something dark smeared all over my door handle. My hands started shaking when I got closer and realized it was blood with a note taped above it saying, "You'll pay for making me bleed." I called 911 right away and didn't touch touch anything. The cops pulled the security footage, and there was Margaret at 4 a.m. cutting her own hand with a knife and wiping it all over my door. They arrested her that same day for violating the restraining order. She spent one night in jail before Daniel bailed her out, which made me so mad I threw my phone across the room. The detective called me later and said this was actually good for our case because judges really hate when people ignore their orders. That's when Daniel called me crying so hard I could barely understand him. He kept saying Margaret was destroying his marriage and his wife wanted her out, but she threatened to kill herself every time they tried. He apologized over and over for not believing me before. I told him I couldn't trust him yet after everything and hung up. A week later, Linda from APS called to tell me Margaret had been calling them every single day with new complaints about me. They were actually considering charging her with false reporting and wasting government resources. She was basically building the case against herself without even knowing it. I started working from home most days after my boss said they understood what I was going through. The hypervigilance was killing me slowly. I checked every lock 3 times before bed and took pictures of them to prove to myself later that I'd done it. I scanned every parking lot before getting out of my car and screenshotted every text and email and voicemail. This wasn't living anymore. It was just surviving one day at a time. Marcus texted me his Ring doorbell footage one morning and my stomach dropped. There was Margaret trying to get into his apartment at 6 a.m., claiming she needed to check on her sick daughter. When he wouldn't open the door, she started screaming that he was holding me hostage. He had already called the cops and filed his own report, which meant more evidence for our case. The prosecutor called to say the criminal trial was set for 6 months out, which was apparently fast for the court system. Margaret's lawyer immediately requested a competency evaluation, claiming she had dementia. The judge ordered a full psychiatric assessment, which would take another month. Then I got a call from my old college that made my blood run cold. Someone pretending to be me had requested my transcripts be sent to 12 different employers with a letter saying I'd faked my degree. The registrar caught it because the signature didn't match the one on file. Margaret was trying to destroy my entire career now. Nina started meeting with me twice a week after that to help me get my life back on track. The first thing we worked on was basic stuff like eating regular meals again since I'd been living on coffee and crackers for weeks. She had me start small with just walking around my apartment building at first because I was too scared to go outside during normal hours. After a couple weeks, I found this 24-hour gym that was mostly empty at 3 a.m. and started using their treadmill when no one else was around. It felt weird celebrating such tiny victories, but Nina kept reminding me that healing doesn't happen in straight lines. 3 months after that midnight visit from Margaret, the court finally got the psychiatric evaluation results back. The doctor found her completely competent to stand trial with no signs of dementia or mental illness that would excuse her behavior. Her lawyer immediately switched tactics and started arguing she was just emotionally distressed from being abandoned by her ungrateful daughter. I met Jennifer for coffee one afternoon at this little place near the courthouse, and she'd become a real friend through all this mess. She told me about her ex-husband who stalked her for 5 years after their divorce, and how the police didn't take it seriously until he broke into her house. The system is slow, she said, but it does work eventually, and you're doing everything right. The next morning, I went down to the parking garage, and my car wouldn't start at all. I called my mechanic who came with a tow truck and found sugar bored into my gas tank, plus my brake lines had been cut clean through. The security footage from that section of the garage was mysteriously corrupted, but the timestamp matched exactly when Daniel had come to the building, supposedly to apologize to me last week. I realized then that he was still completely under Margaret's control and willing to do whatever she wanted. Detective added attempted vehicular sabotage to the growing list of charges against Margaret. The DA called me personally to say they were taking this extremely seriously now because the escalation pattern showed I was in real danger. They offered Margaret a plea deal of 2 years probation with mandatory psychiatric treatment if she'd just leave me alone. Margaret rejected the plea deal immediately and told the court she was confident she'd win at trial. Her lawyer filed paperwork to withdraw from the case, citing irreconcilable differences, which basically meant even he couldn't deal with her anymore. She decided to represent herself, which my lawyer said was the best possible thing for our case since she'd probably incriminate herself. By this point, I hadn't slept through a full night in 3 months, and the constant stress was destroying my health. My stomach hurt all the time, and I couldn't keep food down, so my doctor ran tests and diagnosed stress-induced gastritis. He prescribed medication and strongly recommended I keep seeing Nina for therapy to manage the anxiety. Linda called me with shocking news that completely changed everything about the case. They'd found records from Arizona showing Margaret had done this exact same thing 20 years ago to a former friend who refused to lend her money. The harassment pattern was identical, including fake letters to employers and showing up at the person's home uninvited. 2 weeks later, I got a call from someone I never expected to hear from. Daniel's wife, Sophia, wanted to meet with me because she was filing for divorce and had evidence about Margaret's behavior. She brought recordings where Margaret threatened to destroy their marriage if Daniel didn't help her get me back under her control. The support group had become my anchor point through all this chaos, and we celebrated every small victory together. One member finally got her permanent restraining order approved, and another's parent had just been arrested for violating their protective order. Patricia brought cookies shaped like handcuffs as a dark joke about our shared struggles with the legal system. That night after the meeting, I felt oddly hopeful, and even managed to sleep without checking my locks 3 times like usual. Patricia bringing handcuff-shaped cookies to a support group meeting seems like such an odd choice for comfort food. That whole detail makes me wonder what kind of atmosphere they're really creating in these meetings. Dark humor as a coping mechanism, or something else entirely going on there. Something jerked me awake at 4 in the morning, and I lay there trying to figure out what felt wrong. My apartment door was open about 6 inches, and cold air was drifting in from the hallway. I grabbed my phone and called 911 while staying in my bedroom with the door locked. The cops found no one inside, but everything had been moved just slightly off center. My coffee table was turned 10 degrees, and all my kitchen chairs faced the wrong way. On my pillow where I'd been sleeping was a photo of me taken through my bedroom window. Written on the back in Margaret's handwriting were the words, "I can always get to you." The lock had been professionally picked with no damage to the door or frame at all. This time the cops took it seriously and arrested Margaret that afternoon at her apartment. The judge denied bail completely since she'd violated the restraining order and broken into my home. Daniel showed up at the hearing trying to argue for her release, but even he couldn't deny the evidence. Marcus boss offered to let me stay at his place while my apartment became a crime scene. He made pasta that first night and didn't ask any questions when I couldn't eat. His couch was more comfortable than I expected, and his presence in the next room helped me sleep. The crime scene techs found Margaret's fingerprints on my doorknob and the photo which sealed her case. 4 months passed with Margaret in jail awaiting trial, and I started to breathe easier. Then my lawyer called me in for Daniel's deposition, and everything shifted again. Daniel broke down completely when questioned about helping Margaret get into my building. He pulled out his phone and showed text after text where she threatened to destroy his marriage. She said she'd tell his wife about an affair from years ago if he didn't help her. She threatened to show up at his kid's school and make a scene about being kept from her grandchildren. He was crying so hard he could barely speak as he admitted being terrified of her too. The prosecutor added witness tampering and extortion charges to Margaret's growing list. I moved back to my apartment with new deadbolts and security bars on every window. Motion sensors covered every inch of space and cameras recorded everything inside and out. It didn't feel like home anymore, but more like a bunker I was hiding in. I thought about moving but refused to let her chase me from the life I'd built. My lawyer called with news that made my stomach drop even further. The forensic accountant they'd hired found Margaret had opened 7 credit cards in my name. She'd also taken out 2 personal loans totaling $73,000 in fraudulent debt. Bank records showed she'd used the money for luxury handbags and weekend casino trips. This pushed everything to federal level since the fraud crossed state lines. From her jail cell, Margaret started writing letters to every relative she could think of. She told them I'd abused her and stolen from her and abandoned her in her time of need. Most of my family knew better, but cousins I hadn't talked to in years started messaging me. They called me heartless and said I should be ashamed of treating my mother this way. I had to make all my social media private and block dozens of people. The federal prosecutor took over the case and explained Margaret faced up to 15 years if convicted. Her court-appointed lawyer tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Margaret refused everything. She insisted on going to trial because she still believed she was the victim here. Nina helped me write my victim impact statement over several painful sessions. Every word felt like pulling glass from my skin as I condensed decades of abuse into pages. Nina kept reminding me that speaking my truth would take away Margaret's power over me. 3 weeks before trial, someone knocked on my door using Margaret's exact pattern. My whole body froze as I checked the Ring camera and saw Daniel standing there crying. Against every instinct I had, I spoke to him through the door without opening it. His voice cracked as he started talking about the photos Margaret had from when he was 19 and sold weed for 3 months after dropping out of college. She'd kept them all these years and started using them against him 6 months ago when she needed someone to help her get to me. She'd threatened to send them to his boss at the bank where he worked as a loan officer. Through the door, I could hear him sobbing about how he'd helped her find my address and watched my apartment for her and hated himself every single day for it. He said he couldn't lose his job because his wife was pregnant with their second kid and they'd just bought a house. I told him to go to the police and tell them everything. He said he would tomorrow morning. I watched through the peephole as he walked away with his shoulders shaking. 5 months passed before the criminal trial finally started. I'd spent those months in therapy twice a week and moved to a new apartment with better security and no balcony access. The first day of trial, Margaret rolled into the courtroom in a wheelchair she definitely didn't need based on the surveillance videos of her walking around stores just days before. She wore a gray cardigan and had her hair in a bun like she was somebody's sweet grandma instead of the woman who'd tried to destroy my life. The prosecutor laid out the case piece by piece, starting with the Ring camera footage from my apartment and the recordings Marcus had made. They showed document after document of her harassment and threats. The judge had to warn Margaret 3 times to stop making faces and gestures at me from the defense table. On the second day, Margaret's lawyer tried to stop her, but she insisted on taking the stand anyway. She started crying about how I'd always been jealous of Daniel and had stolen money from her when I was a teenager, which was a complete lie. She claimed I'd conspired against her since childhood and that everything was my fault. The prosecutor pulled out bank records showing she'd never reported any theft and had actually taken money from my college fund. He showed receipts for luxury items she'd bought while claiming to be broke and needing my help. Her story kept changing every time he asked a question, and by the end, even her own lawyer looked tired. When it was my turn to testify, I sat in that chair for 3 hours straight. Margaret stared at me the whole time, trying to intimidate me with her glares and little hand movements her lawyer pretended not to see. I talked about growing up with her constant criticism and neglect. I described finding her in my apartment and the months of harassment that followed. I explained the fear I felt every time I heard a knock at my door or saw an unknown number calling. Several jurors looked sympathetic, especially when I talked about having to quit my job because I was too anxious to focus. The prosecutor then brought up something I didn't even know about, which was that Margaret had done this before in Arizona 20 years ago. A woman appeared on the video screen and testified about how Margaret had harassed her for months after a dispute over a rental property. The pattern was exactly the same, including the fake health problems and showing up at her home uninvited. Margaret's face went red, and she started whispering angrily to her lawyer. During a break, I sat in the courthouse cafe with my hands shaking so bad I couldn't hold my coffee cup steady. An older woman at the next table leaned over and said quietly that she'd been on a jury for a similar case and to stay strong because the truth would win. Those small moments of kindness from strangers were the only thing keeping me together. When we went back in, they played recordings from someone I didn't recognize at first until the prosecutor identified her as a co-worker Margaret had tried to recruit. The woman had recorded Margaret saying she would destroy me completely and make me wish I'd never been born. Daniel sat in the gallery with his head in his hands during this part. Marcus testified next about what he'd witnessed and recorded. He stayed calm even when Margaret's lawyer tried to make him look like a busybody neighbor who was obsessed with me. Marcus just kept presenting facts about Margaret trying to break into his apartment when she thought I might be hiding there and the threats she'd made against both of us. The defense tried to argue that Margaret was a desperate mother driven to extremes by my cruel abandonment. They painted her as a loving parent who just wanted a relationship with her daughter. The prosecutor responded by showing her credit card statements with thousands in luxury purchases made during the same time period she was claiming poverty and illness. That evening after court, Daniel approached me outside on the courthouse steps. He said he was going to testify for the prosecution tomorrow and that it was time he stood up to her, even even though he was scared about his job. He apologized for taking so long to do the right thing. I nodded but kept walking because I still couldn't trust him completely after everything that had happened. The next morning, I sat in the courtroom watching Daniel take the witness stand. His hands shook as he placed them on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The prosecutor started with easy questions about our family history and then moved to the hard stuff. Daniel told the court how Margaret had been lying about her health for years, using fake medical reports she'd found online to manipulate both of us. He pulled out his phone and showed text messages where she'd coached him on what to say to me, how to make me feel guilty, how to pressure me into taking her in. The prosecutor asked him about the night she showed up at my door with the police. Daniel admitted she'd called him first, bragging about her plan to force her way into my apartment using a fake wellness check. He said she'd laughed about it, called me weak, and said I'd cave like I always did. Daniel spilling tea on the witness stand like he's hosting the world's most awkward family reunion. Turns out Margaret's been running a masterclass in manipulation with him as her star student who finally flunked out. Margaret jumped up from her seat and started screaming that he was a liar, a traitor, that she'd given him everything, and this was how he repaid her. The judge banged his gavel and ordered the bailiffs to remove her from the courtroom. She kept screaming as they dragged her out, yelling that we'd both burn in hell for abandoning her. Daniel kept going after she was gone, his voice steadier now. He told them about the credit card she'd opened in my name, how she'd used his computer to do it and made him promise not to tell anyone. He showed bank statements proving she'd been getting disability payments while claiming to be too sick to work but healthy enough to stalk me across the city. The defense attorney tried to make Daniel look unreliable, bringing up his job at the bank and suggesting Margaret had helped him get it. Daniel stayed calm and explained that he'd gotten the job on his own merit, but Margaret had threatened to ruin his career if he didn't help her harass me. 2 days later, we sat through closing arguments. The prosecutor laid out everything piece by piece, showing the jury a timeline of Margaret's escalating behavior from the first phone call to the night she broke into my apartment. She called Margaret a calculating predator who'd terrorized her own daughter for months. The defense attorney painted a different picture, talking about a confused elderly woman abandoned by her family, suggesting maybe Margaret really believed she was sick and just wanted her daughter's love. The jury left to deliberate at 3 in the afternoon. By 7 that evening, they were back. The judge asked the foreman to read the verdict and my hands went numb. Guilty on all counts. Stalking, guilty. Harassment, guilty. Identity theft, guilty. Breaking and entering, guilty. Violation of restraining order, guilty. Impersonating a federal officer, guilty. Margaret started shouting that the jury was corrupt, that I'd poisoned everyone against her, that she was the real victim here. The judge ordered her removed again and set sentencing for 2 weeks later. I watched them lead her away in handcuffs and felt nothing. Not relief, not victory, just empty and tired like someone had drained all the feeling out of me. Nina had warned me about this when we'd talked the week before. She'd said justice wouldn't erase the trauma, that the real work would start after the trial ended. 2 weeks later, I sat in the same courtroom for sentencing. The judge talked for 20 minutes about the severity of Margaret's crimes, the deliberate nature of her actions, the complete lack of remorse she'd shown. He sentenced her to 8 years in federal prison with mandatory psychiatric treatment. She'd serve at least 5 with good behavior. Margaret refused to look at me while he read the sentence. Her lawyer had told her not to say anything, but I could see her jaw clenched tight, her hands balled into fists. They led her away, and that was it. 8 years of knowing she couldn't show up at my door. The civil lawsuit wrapped up quickly after the criminal conviction. Margaret's insurance covered some of the identity theft damages, and the court ordered her assets liquidated to pay the rest. Her house, her car, her savings, all got sold off. I'd recover about 60% of what I'd lost, which wasn't perfect, but it was something. The lawyer said I was lucky to get that much back. That first night after sentencing, I couldn't relax in my own apartment. Every small sound made me jump. A neighbor's door closing sent my heart racing. The ice maker in my fridge made me grab my phone to call 911. My body didn't know how to exist without being on constant alert. Nina had said this would happen, that my nervous system would take time to realize the danger had actually passed. She prescribed me something mild to help me sleep and told me to be patient with myself. 3 weeks after sentencing, I got a thick envelope from Daniel. Inside was a 4-page letter written in his messy handwriting. He apologized for everything, for not standing up to Margaret sooner, for helping her harass me, for choosing his job over doing the right thing. He wrote about being in therapy now, working through his own issues with Margaret's manipulation and control. He said our mother had been playing us against each other since we were kids, making us compete for scraps of her approval. He didn't ask for forgiveness and said he understood if I never wanted to speak to him again. He just wanted me to know he finally understood why I'd had to protect myself and that he was proud of me for being strong enough to do it. I started the long process of unfreezing my credit and rebuilding my financial life. Each phone call to a credit bureau felt like taking back a piece of myself that Margaret had tried to steal. The credit repair company said my score would take years to fully recover, but every small step forward mattered. I opened new bank accounts, got new credit cards with tiny limits, started rebuilding from scratch. A month after sentencing, I walked into my support group meeting and told everyone Margaret was in prison. The room erupted in applause. Patricia jumped up and hugged me tight, tears running down her face. She kept saying I did it. I survived and got justice. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I actually believed her. That night, Marcus knocked on my door with takeout from the Thai place down the street, and we sat on my couch eating pad Thai and talking about normal stuff for the first time in 7 months. He told me about a logo he was designing for a coffee shop, and I talked about a marketing campaign I was working on, and it felt so weird to have a regular conversation that didn't involve cops or lawyers or crisis management. 2 weeks later, I looked around my apartment and realized I couldn't stay there anymore. Not because I was scared, but because every corner held bad memories of Margaret trying to break in or standing in my hallway. Marcus helped me pack boxes, and as I taped them shut, I felt lighter with each one, like I was sealing away all the bad stuff that happened here. My new place was across town in a better neighborhood with a doorman and security cameras, and best of all, no memories of Margaret anywhere. While unpacking, I found a shoebox full of old photos from when I was a kid, and for the first time I could really see how small and scared I looked in all of them. This little girl trying so hard to be good enough for a mom who would never love her back. I sat on my new bedroom floor and told that little girl in the pictures that it wasn't her fault, and she did the best she could, and I forgave her for not being able to protect herself from Margaret. The next week, I had my last regular therapy session with Dr. Patel, who told me we'd move to monthly check-ins since I was doing so much better. She looked at me and said I'd done the hardest thing by breaking the cycle, and that Margaret not being able to control me was her failure, not mine. 3 months after the sentencing, Jennifer called me into her office and told me she'd recommended me for a senior marketing position that came with a big raise and more responsibility. I accepted right away and felt real excitement about my future for the first time since this whole mess started. Daniel texted me a week later asking if we could get coffee, and we met at a Starbucks downtown where he showed me pictures on his phone of divorce papers he'd just signed. He said being in therapy was helping him see how messed up everything with Margaret was, and while we might never be close, we were both working on healing. A month later, a letter came to my apartment with the prison return address, and I knew it was from Margaret, but I didn't open it. Instead, I brought it to support group, where Patricia explained they had this ritual called a freedom fire, where unopened letters from abusers got burned in a metal trash can out back. I watched the envelope curl up and turn black, and it felt like watching a whole chapter of my life close forever. Some nights I still woke up sweating from dreams where Margaret was at my door again, but each time I reminded myself she was locked up and I was safe, and the dreams came less often as the months went by. Marcus and I started officially dating after a few months of taking things slow, and he understood when I had bad days or got triggered by certain things. He never pushed and always celebrated the small wins with me, like when I could answer an unknown number without panicking, or when I went a whole week without checking the locks 3 times before bed. 6 months after sentencing, I was chopping vegetables for dinner in my new kitchen with my favorite true crime podcast playing when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart jumped for a second until I read it and saw it was Patricia from group checking in to see how I was doing. I smiled and texted back that I was good and asked how she was, and then went back to making my stir fry while garlic sizzled in the pan. And for the first time in my whole life, I felt completely free. Thanks for sticking around for the whole thing. It's been a ride sharing it with you. Until next time, like the video. It helps more than you think.